Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Salah Goss, and I'm the Senior Vice President, heading up social impact for North America at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. Today, we will have what I know will be a lively and robust conversation on the impact of COVID on women, and especially the disproportionate impact on Black, Hispanic women, and other women of color. To me, what is particularly critical about this conversation is our focus on the economic impact. And not because this is a narrowing of the subject, but because it gives us an opportunity to acknowledge how all-encompassing and complex the economic lives of women really are. Women are often primary decision makers in household expenses and budgets, are multi-generational caretakers, making economic decisions often for both children and older parents. And women have exponentially, before the pandemic, increased their buying power. But the outsized contribution to what some call the female economy relies on women's ability to be productively contribute to the workplace and to earn a living that supports them and the households that they care for. The fallout of the pandemic has called this very thing into question. It has exacerbated existing disparities and structural shortcomings to women's access to quality jobs, and especially Black and Latinx women. So there's a lot to dig into here. And I couldn't think of two better people to have this conversation with than the two women who are joining me today. It's with great pleasure that I introduce our panelists to this conversation. Joining me is Lelaine Bigelow, Interim Vice President for Congressional Relations and Economic Justice at the National Partnership for Women and Families, and Kavya Vaghul, Senior Director of Research for Just Capital. Welcome, Kavya. Welcome, Lelaine. So let's dive in. Let's start with our first question, and I think this will help set the scene for our discussion. I want to dig into a little bit how the pandemic has exacerbated workplace disparities for women, and especially women of color. To kick us off, Lelaine, let me ask you to share some important facts, providing us with a shared baseline to start the conversation. Lelaine, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I definitely want to say thank you to the Financial Health Network for inviting me to be on this panel, and my colleague at Mastercard and Just Capital. It's an honor to be on the panel with you. And I'm really excited to talk about this. I think it's really important to say that it wasn't just the pandemic, but structural racism and patriarchy are to blame for the suffering of women and women of color in this moment. And I know it sounds like a very bold statement, but I hope by the end of this conversation, you'll feel differently. Things were not fine before, and they got even worse. And I want to give credit to Senator Klobuchar for the following stats that I'm going to say, because I heard her say it this morning, and I thought they were so compelling. But in 1955, women were a third of the labor force, and we've made progress. And in January 2019, women were a larger part of the labor force than men. But when we look at the pandemic, women have lost more than 1 million more jobs than men. And that's a crisis. And why did they leave? They left because we have a caregiving crisis. The individual reason, over 10 million people cite that caregiving is the reason why many people stopped working. And women are largely caregivers in our society. Women of color tend to experience greater health needs and have more caregiving responsibilities. And some of those health needs are rooted in inadequate care of structural racism. And women also experience the wage gap. Women in the United States are paid 82 cents for every dollar to men, amounting to an annual gender wage gap of over $10,000. For women of color, it's worse. Black women are typically paid 63 cents. Native American women are paid 60 cents, Latinas are paid 55 cents, and Asian American and Pacific Islanders are paid as little as 52 cents to the dollar. And it's kind of frustrating sometimes when you talk about it in cents, but it's real money, because if we eliminated the wage gap, women could afford more than 13 additional months of childcare, nearly 65 weeks of food, that's more than a year, more than 9 additional months of rent. So it's real money to people, and it makes an economic impact. And I know we're going to touch on this a little bit more later, but the caregiving crisis really has a detrimental effect on economic mobility and security for women and women of color. Getting a good job and keeping it is one of the best ways to improve a person's economic standing. So when people leave work, it hurts financially. And for older workers, leaving the workforce can mean over $300,000 in lost wages and retirement. So I'll just wrap up here and just say the caregiving crisis really affects women and women of color across their lifespan.
Thank you. And Kavya, can I ask you to add to this? In your view, how has the pandemic exacerbated workplace disparities for women?
Absolutely. Thank you. Again, thank you to the Financial Health Network and my colleagues on this panel for having us. So I think about things a lot from the corporate perspective, because at Just Capital, we focus a lot on how corporations play a role in this larger kind of crisis that's going on. And one of the things that I think is important to add to this is that women of color are disproportionately on the front lines of the pandemic, both at health risk for COVID, but also in industries that have been hit hardest by unemployment claims and fast job loss. And when we think about kind of the ways that occupational segregation works and this dynamic that the COVID crisis has brought along, I wonder too how the disparities in types of jobs that women have, and specifically women of color have, and not having access to the types of benefits that would enable them to take the time off that's necessary for caregiving, play a role in exacerbating some of these disparities as well.
Yeah, and I guess you guys have painted a really good picture. You talked about existing structural inequalities, the caregiving crisis, the types of jobs that women have, and the vulnerability that creates. So now that we have a good picture of what's occurred, let's switch gears a little bit and focus on the future. And I'm wondering to what extent the trends that we've just discussed will shape the economic lives of women going forward. We know that studies across multiple institutions show the impact of COVID could dramatically, potentially reverse any progress made in securing workplace and pay equity for women, especially when adding in the factors we talked about, like race, ethnicity, having children, or being the primary breadwinner. The impact to women, I would say, therefore, is not just a woman's problem, but affects the overall economy. And I actually think there's a risk to economic security and our ability to have inclusive growth. And because of this, some would argue that inaction could cost billions and set gender equity back as far as a generation. So let me come back to you, Lelaine. What would you say to this? What do you think the impact will be? What will we see this impact in terms of the future of the economic lives of women going forward because of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, women are not sharing in what we're seeing as in the recovery right now. About 3/4 of the job gains went to men, and Black and white women actually saw employment losses last month, losing 20,000 and 42,000 jobs respectively. So, when you mentioned the $1 billion, it's $500 billion in lost economic activity because women don't have access to paid leave. And that was before the pandemic. So I can't imagine what those numbers are now. And that definitely has an impact on, from everyone, from the individuals to the larger scale economic business, businesses. So I think that it's really important to be thinking about this as not just an individual problem, and families just haven't gotten organized enough to be able to take care of their loved ones. This is a national economic situation.
Yeah. Kavya, would you add anything to that perspective?
Yeah, I think just re-emphasizing some of those important statistics that Lelaine spoke about too. Unmet childcare needs impact employers as well. Prior to the pandemic, employers were estimated to lose about $12.7 billion a year due to breakdowns in childcare or dependent care arrangements that led to lower employee productivity, greater absenteeism, and greater turnover. And when we've started looking at this in the context of the COVID crisis, there have been studies from Brookings that have shown that the school closure costs alone will be about $56 billion per month in lost productivity. And as the crisis continues, we see that there's more long-term effects on the overall financial well-being for not just those immediate women and their families, but the broader economy. And so I'd add those things. I'd also like to say that I think when we think about this broader context and the broader situation, women as breadwinners is critical. Thinking about how Black women and Latina women are core breadwinners in their communities and in their families, especially compared to other race and ethnic groups. And women historically have faced longer spells of unemployment at higher rates than other groups, specifically women of color, which really leads us to think about the downstream effects of what this pandemic could cause, especially if we're not addressing it now with the right types of caregiving instruments. We've also known that this rampant care crisis is blossoming and exploding even more now with the pandemic at large. And we're also seeing longer-term trends around labor market discrimination that will continue to be a problem as women try to re-enter the workforce.
Yeah, and I think those are all important points. And I think those are all important points. And maybe I can just mention three when I think about the future. And you guys kind of mentioned some of this, so maybe just to summarize what was said and maybe add hopefully a few new ideas, is that we cannot forget, we've mentioned, but we cannot forget about the long-standing structural inequalities that we saw were fueled by racism, sexism, ethnic stereotypes, and other forms of bias. They've created an uneven playing field or landscape that makes it difficult for many women of color to secure jobs with solid wages, but also robs them of the opportunity to easily re-enter the workforce or, when doing so, have career advancement. I think the second thing, and relatedly I would mention, is that I hope we consider well-being. We want to invest in women's productivity, but also in women's happiness. And I was just reading a study from Women in the Workplace's 2020 study that shows that despite all the efforts that companies are making to support employees during the crisis, women are feeling more exhausted, burnt out, and under even more pressure. So to me, this suggests that companies need to do more to adjust to the norms and expectations to create a better support system to help facilitate women's entry back into the workforce. And then finally, I hope that we think about reskilling. We saw during the pandemic, automation and digitization trends accelerate. And as women re-enter the economy and the economy re-emerges, I think we need to think about women's pathways to this and re-engaging in the workforce, because this could be even steeper and made even steeper by the need to reskill or even find a new career pathway. So let's stay on the role of employers for a minute. And I'll ask you, Kavya, to weigh in here. In your view, what or even government agencies can do, either in the short or the long term, to address the ongoing effects of COVID-19 on the economic lives of women?
I think that's a fantastic question, and I'll preface it by saying that there's a lot of room for employers in this space, largely because employers don't put enough of an emphasis on family economic security, and when they do, it's concentrated to certain industries. So there's a large space that employers can take and play, especially as we're waiting on kind of federal provisions to take place. And what these spaces really are things like paid leave. During the pandemic, our data showed that just 21% of the largest employers in the United States, this is the Russell 1000, provided a new or expanded paid. That's 21%. It's a small number, and there's a lot of room for companies to step up and provide those provisions for workers, women and women of color, especially as they have caregiving responsibilities due to health issues, due to and kind of care arrangements and all of those items. On the note of dependent care specifically, before the pandemic, we found that a vast majority of companies aren't providing any type of childcare benefit or dependent care benefit to working parents. Our research and data collection, 6% of companies provided childcare through center-based or on-site care. 8% were offering subsidies for dependent care, and 15% were offering a backup care subsidy for times when care arrangements fall through. Take a look at what happened during the pandemic. Just 9% of companies expanded these specific backup dependent care or subsidy-based dependent care benefits for their employees. And that shows that there's a huge space that employers can begin to take up, to step up to the plate, to provide the types of dependent care benefits that are necessary for addressing the type of caregiving crisis that we're experiencing right now. The challenge too is kind of on the structure of the benefits that companies provide. Employers often constrain these benefits to things like backup care, but we know from all of our research outside that backup dependent care is only solving one very small piece of the larger caregiving crisis. If there is an ongoing care crisis, something that families are experiencing every day, and so 15 days of backup care doesn't do nearly enough to address what it is that families need at this time. I think also it's critical for employers to focus on the racial equity aspects of all of the decisions that they're making as they move towards hiring and considering kind of turnover rates at their companies. So anti-discrimination policies is certainly a space where employers can step up. And a number of our research elements from Just Capital show that companies are making the commitments, but following through on the actual active steps that they can do to address these kind of disparities in labor market discrimination fall short. Additionally, pay equity analyses. We know that companies have pay inequities. We see that from EEOC filings, but addressing those and being real about where they are and how they plan to move forward and basically ameliorate differences in pay becomes even more important. And I'd be remiss to say I have to say that part of this whole equation is about raising wages as well. With conversations about the ongoing labor shortages, it's very clear that we have a wage issue, which has been going on for a very long time. So paying a living wage to workers, especially women and women of color who are working disproportionately in low-wage jobs, is something that is critical as part of this entire package that employers can provide.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the wage gap, because I think it was Lelaine who corrected my billions and had a comment on that. And can you just reiterate, because I think that was a pretty striking number, and Kavya picked up on it too, this issue of the wage gap. Can you just dig into that a little more if you don't mind, Lelaine?
Sure. And I think you just said billions, and I just put the actual number that I know, which is 500 billion into it. Yeah. So that's a lot of economic activity for the economists that love that word. So I just think that, to kind of go through some of those numbers again for the wage gap. So Black women are typically paid 63 cents to the dollar, Native American 60 cents, Latinas 55 cents, and Asian American and Pacific Islander women are paid as little as 52 cents. I mean, that's just atrocious. There's no other word for that. And there's so much rooted into how those numbers have, stayed so low. And a lot of it is because of the caregiving crisis and when people have to leave work. And, to kind of circle back to the original question, I think, what you mentioned too was what I think employers really understood, before the crisis that it was important for people to be at work, but after this crisis, they need to understand it's okay for people to be away from work. And that is what we all need to learn, I think, as a part of the employment system. And the thing that I would say too is care is infrastructure. That's what we need to all think about, because if we don't, it will impede our economic recovery. And it's not just going to trickle down because if we do the roads and bridges, everything will be okay, because physical infrastructure jobs are male dominated. Over 90% of those jobs go to men, and men also need to care for their kids and also need to care for their parents. And so we should be thinking about this in a more gender equitable way if we want to realize true recovery and get to those hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah. And did you want to add anything on the question of what can employers or even government agencies or policies do to help alleviate this?
Oh, sure. I mean, we need a care infrastructure. So we need a national paid leave policy, and we need to invest in childcare. And they can't be thought of as okay, we can only do one and maybe we'll do the other later. We need a full system of supports, which was Kavya was saying, to really help people deal with caregiving across the lifespan. And I think there's a lot of conversation too about people who are in the sandwich generation. And I don't think enough conversation too has been around supporting older workers and how they're caregiving for their parents.
Yeah. And I want to maybe just take a breath for a minute. We have heard these numbers that we're all throwing out. And I think one of you said they were startling or disturbing, whichever word you use. Yes, I agree. And it's really important to show the economic impact. But let me ask you both, because you're subject matter experts, you're working on this day to day. Can you just tell us a little bit about the impact you've seen on women? You know, not just women as, functioning pieces of the economy that will help us move forward, but some of them may be the personal impacts or stories of what this really means. It affects us all. I mean, we're all women, we can relate, but even those who can't, you should be able to think about something even if you don't go through it. But I think it's still important to tell some of the human stories. So can I just ask either of you just to weigh in and give us kind of a picture of what this looks like?
I can jump in and just say, I think this is not the economic case, but it can be, because it can mean life or death for a lot of people. So if you have a cancer diagnosis and you are looking to care for yourself, if you don't have paid leave and you can't take time to go to your treatments and you're stressed out about that, we have seen what that stress and that inability to get care, has on people's lives. And I think that is what, comes to mind to me first and foremost when I've seen people share their stories is, it really becomes about picking up their parents on the side of the road because they have, they have Alzheimer's and they've left the house and they're very stressed out about their job and taking the time off to go find their parents. And those are the kind of, sort of tragic stories that, don't make up a lot of numbers, but I think are really poignant to just illustrating the story that people are going through a tough time and you're not going to organize your way out of it. And they also don't deserve to lose their job at a moment of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the stories that keeps coming back to my mind, and one of the common threads between the stories that I've heard, is this idea of, we think a lot about kind of the benefits that we need to be providing in order to cover the gaps for caregivers. But what do we think about the actual types of benefits and supports that caregivers need? One theme has been this idea of respite. What's the type of rest? What's the type of kind of sanctuary that these caregivers can take, especially after being responsible for caregiving for multiple generations, for their families, and how do they begin to take care of themselves? And so what are the types of benefits that we need to think about for actual caregivers, understanding that these caregivers disproportionately are women and women of color?
Yeah, we just have a couple minutes left, but I just wanted to ask you guys to think about and maybe express, what do we lose if we don't act? I know I mentioned that inaction can cost billions to the economy and perhaps can set a lot of the progress back that we made, but in your words, what's at risk here? What do we lose if we don't take care of this crisis? Kavya, I'll start with you.
Sounds good. Honestly, we are already on an extremely precarious pathway where we are now. And if all of these things are exacerbated, we'll continue to see challenges that women face in terms of employment, in terms of discrimination, in terms of wage inequities. All of these things will be exacerbated. And I think that will have detrimental impacts to our economy. But we also have to think about it from kind of a value perspective as well. This is not just an economic equation. There's a fundamental value shift that is required of people in the United States and many other countries to begin to understand the importance of caregiving and the value that it has, not just to our economy, but to the people that we are and the people that we nurture. And so I think there's a lot to lose economically, especially because the current path that we're on will only get worse.
Lelaine, anything to add?
Well, I will just say that to me, paid leave checks all the boxes. It's economic security, it's healthcare, it's public health, it's racial equity, it's infrastructure, and it's gender equity. So it's really amazing that you can kind of do all of this positive stuff for the American people and for our country by enacting really good national policy. And so those are the things that I really wish that we could think about that, like, wow, this policy helps a ton of people and it's, worth the investment.
Well said. And I always like to leave the conversation with a call to action. So if you would have anyone watching either remember one thing you said, well, I'm not going to make it that easy. If you could inspire action of anyone watching, what is the one thing you would say in terms of a call to action? And Lelaine, I'll stay with you to have you go first.
Yeah, and I'll just say that these policies are really politically popular. So when you poll childcare, when you poll paid leave, you have over 70% of Republicans and Democrats and independents support this policy. So that's pretty much 100% in most people's minds. And so these are things that I think aren't partisan issues, and we should be able to work in them in that way. And so when I think about the conversation that's happening in DC around the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, my call to action is to both of those need to pass together. We don't need to choose one or the other, and that they go together for a true gender equitable recovery.
Well said. Kavya, what's your call to action?
My call to action is that companies have expressed that there is a deep interest that they have in addressing the diversity, equity, and inclusion issues that they've finally begun to witness and understand over the past year. And I think if companies truly care about diversity of their workforce, they care about addressing structural racism, if they care about addressing gender inequities, they should see caregiving as part of their responsibility of the set of benefits that they need to be providing to support family economic security.
What a great note to end on. So I'd like to thank you both. I know in preparing for this, we were saying how excited we were to have this conversation because we're hearing here and there about the effect of women, but you two as subject experts lay it out so well, make it come to life. So I want to thank you both for what's been an invigorating conversation. I think we've learned a lot. I certainly have. And I'm sure you've inspired some folks to action. So I think now we're going to take a few questions from the audience. So send in the questions, keep them coming. And so let's keep this conversation going. So the first one I see is, in this era of intense political division, how might policymakers position these solutions as politically palatable and beneficial to our entire economy? And I think, Lelaine, you started saying that these policies are popular. So what would you say to that question? How can you even further position some of these policy recommendations so they're not polarizing?
Yeah, well, I think it's good to know that, just to reiterate that they aren't truly polarizing. And I think that when you look at the economic case that we've laid out, they sort of pay for themselves as well, because inaction, like you said, also costs money. And so are we really just going to stay and do nothing and lose billions of dollars from the economy? Are businesses going to continue to lose women from the workforce when they know that impacts their bottom line? And are we going to let individuals suffer when they have to take care of their families? And so those are nonpartisan issues. And when you talk to members, I'd say one-on-one, they believe in those things. It's often about, getting away from the theater of it all and really making the case to them one-on-one. And so we've had Republicans and Democrats support these policies, both for paid leave and childcare. It's just about trying to get something done in Washington, which I know is difficult, but that's my job and I really like it. So I will say I'm really optimistic that we're going to see progress on both of those issues.
Great. Kavya, anything to add quickly? I know we're almost.
No, I think Lelaine covered it really well. And so I'd agree. I'm optimistic. I think that from the company perspective where I live on this side of the issue, I definitely am seeing changes in the data, changes in kind of company policy and disclosure on these topics and a greater engagement around it. And so really eager to see that take on more widely.
Yeah, and what a great question to end with. So thank you both very much for this conversation, and thank the audience for tuning in and for this platform to have the conversation. Take care, everybody.